Supply side economics about encouraging investors to invest. Kind of policies they were encouraging then, people like Thatcher and Reagan, was things like low taxes, uh, deregulation, so there wasn't too much red tape, as it's called, not too much bureaucracy for businesses to abide by. This was thought to encourage businesses to set up weaker unions. So, of course, Thatcher massively curtailed union power, various legislation, um, and yeah, things like that. Those kinds of things were thought to encourage investors to invest. Um, and of course, there was opposition to welfare on a number of grounds, both moral and economic. This is one area where the neoconservatism and the neoliberal combine. So just again, pause the video here and think about, well, what reasons would, what moral reasons and what economic reasons would there be for opposing welfare? Okay, so basically their opposition to welfare was based on a kind of liberal anti-statism attitude of skepticism towards the state that we know is inherent in classical liberalism anyway, and the classical liberal kind of negative conception of freedom, the idea that the state is the greatest threat to freedom, therefore its role should be reduced as far as possible. This was the sort of basic underlying ideology behind the opposition to welfare. But specifically, there was economic opposition, obviously, on the grounds that welfare has to be paid for then out of taxation, and higher taxes were required to pay for it. This is disincentive to investment, damaging to economic growth, and so on. So there's that whole economic argument that you want to keep taxes low, therefore you need to keep public spending, welfare spending low. But there was also a moral argument, and here think about people like Novick. Again, there's basic idea, and again this goes back to classical liberalism as well, self-reliance. People should be reliant on themselves, they shouldn't look to the state to support them, and so on. It encourages people to be dependent on welfare, saps people's self-respect, and so on and so forth. Charles Murray even came up with an interesting argument that it's terrible because it gives women independence from men. They're no longer reliant on men as breadwinners. They can turn to the state instead, and that encourages divorce, creating an underclass of single mothers and fatherless children. So, yeah, he actually thought it was preferable for women to be kind of forced, just economically forced to stay with men. And Nozick, in particular, of course, he, like the classical liberals, very much believed in property rights, and he famously called taxation legalized theft, an involuntary transfer of property from one person to another. So welfare was effectively thieving of money through the tax system from the wealthy who deserved it to the undeserving poor. So all of that together can think of as neoliberalism, the economic side of the new right. But basically it is just free market, laissez-faire, capitalist economics. On the neoconservative side, so we're now going to turn to look at the neoconservative aspects of the new right. The neoconservatism really defined by a fear of social fragmentation and breakdown. And again, pause the video here, think back to the beginning of this lecture. What did they blame for this social fragmentation and breakdown? Okay, so neoconservatives blamed social breakdown on liberal permissiveness. They believed what they call a permissive society had developed from the 1960s, in which people can do whatever they want with no regard for tradition or authority and so on, and this was leading basically to moral degeneracy. So the solution for the neoconservatives is very simple: authority, strengthening respect for authority. Authority gives people a sense of who they are and what's expected of them. And there was an idea within neoconservatism that a good thing would be authoritarian populism. Neoconservatism has sometimes been described as authoritarian populism that responds to a widespread anxiety about the decline of moral standards and the decline of respect for authority. Now, interestingly, there is some overlap here with traditional conservatism and even one nation conservatism. this belief in authority, as we know, is common to all conservatives, not just the New Right. And this part of the New Right shows neoconservatism's origins in traditional conservatism and organicism, the idea of an organic society. And the question is, so that there's an idea there is such a thing as society actually, and it needs to be preserved. Where the New Right and the One Nation conservatives differ is how should society be preserved. So whereas One Nation conservatives believe the best way of binding society together and holding it together is by alleviating poverty, the New Right believe it's by restoring authority and imposing social discipline. And actually, interestingly, they believe the free market is one way of imposing social discipline, for example, on the workforce and so on. So neoconservatives view the decline of authority as being responsible for most modern social problems such as social delinquency, crime, and antisocial behavior. Remember, human nature, the conservative view of human nature, flawed. Humans crave security, and they get this security from knowing where they stand. So therefore, security is provided by the exercise of authority, promoting respect for authority figures, whether it's the father within the family, the teacher within the school, the employer within the workplace, or the police and the system of government and law and order at large within society as a whole. And permissiveness is seen as undermining the established structure of society by encouraging the questioning of authority. So in each social setting, basically neoconservatives seek to strengthen the authority figure, and especially the authority of the employer in the workplace. You can think the attacks on trade unions and so on carried out by Thatcher governments were, a manifestation of this desire to re-establish the authority of the traditional authority figure in the workplace. Three main concerns in terms of policy, three main concerns of neoconservatives. One, law and order, in common with all stripes of conservatism. Two, sort of public morality, and linked to this, number three, national identity. So there's a sort of alongside this social authoritarianism of having authority figures in society is a sort of state authoritarianism, the desire for a strong state to administer a tough stance on law and order. So, pause the video here, think what is the conservative view of the causes of crime? Okay? Neoconservatives believe, like conservatives, traditional conservatives do, there's a quote from Andrew Hayward here, that the roots of disorder reside in the human soul rather than in social injustice. In other words, it's not the structure of society or poverty or anything like that that leads to crime, it's flawed human nature that leads to crime. And therefore, crime can't be remedied by social reforms, alleviating poverty, reducing inequality, anything like that. It can only be reduced by severe punishments. So there's an emphasis from the 80s onwards and in the US and the UK on long custodial sentences, and even in the US, the reintroduction of the death penalty in many US states. And since then, if you look at the graphs of number of prisoners in both countries, they've gone through the roof, really. So the US now has the distinction of having the highest proportion of its population in prison of any society in recorded history. It surpassed about 10 years ago the proportion of its population that were in prison surpassed the record previously held by Stalin in the 1930s in Russia. Second concern of neoconservatism, public morality. So neoconservatives campaign to reverse what they see as the degeneracy of the liberal permissive society that's emerged since the 1960s. Thatcher proclaimed her support for a return to what she called Victorian values. Neoconservatives particularly saw two dangers with the permissive society, where people are kind of free to choose their own lifestyles and beliefs and so on, as opposed to subscribing to kind of traditional lifestyles and beliefs. One is that people may make immoral choices. So, for example, they may choose to, this is obviously highly disputed idea, but maybe choose to be homosexual or pursue a homosexual lifestyle. They may choose to have abortions, premarital sex, view pornography, etc. And all of these things might be viewed by traditional conservatives and perhaps Christians and so on as immoral. So neoconservatives in the US have embarked on campaigns against all of those things. But there's a second danger they see in the permissive society, that actually cultural or moral pluralism, that is where you have several different kind of belief systems, cultures, lifestyles coexisting, the very fact of having different lifestyles and morals and so on coexisting itself is seen as a threat to social cohesion. So neoconservatives believe that for a stable society, the country must be united around shared values. If people are free to make up their own kind of morality or follow their own belief system, then individuals and families are left without moral guidance, and social standards will inevitably fall into decline. This leads neatly into their third priority, national identity. Again, remember, belief in human nature. Human nature is flawed. People are sort of seek security. They're very insecure. They seek security, and one means of getting security is from a strong, stable identity. So national identity is thought to provide that. So neoconservatives are very keen to challenge any threats that they see to national identity, whether they emerge from within the society or from without, externally. So pause the video here and think, what threats might there be to national identity from within and also from abroad, if you like. So from within, the main threat, according to neoconservatives, to a strong, cohesive national identity is seen as multiculturalism and immigration. And actually neoconservatives have often led campaigns against immigration, and sometimes even assigning a privileged status to the so-called host culture. For example, in the US, there have been campaigns to recognize English as the only official language, and so on. You could think about Donald Trump's demands in the early days of his campaign for a register of all Muslims. They should be registered and so on. Then there's also seen as threats to national identity from without, from abroad. So these might have included in the past things like the strength of the Soviet Union, which is a threat to kind of, as I said, Western global power. The rise of European integration, threatening British identity, being submerged into a European identity, threat of terrorism, and so on and so forth. Now, before we finish, I just want to discuss, there's an idea that there are these tensions within the New Right, that the New Right, some people believe it's kind of got contradictory ideas within it. It's a kind of mishmash of contradictory policies. Neoliberalism and neoconservatism, some people say, don't really complement each other. They're actually contradictory. And especially this is the case in terms of the role of the state, right? So if you think about neoliberals, liberalism is traditionally skeptical of the state. It wants minimal state power. It wants kind of power to be dispersed throughout society and not concentrated in the state. They don't want the state to be involved in the economy, etc., etc. So neoliberalism traditionally has quite a skeptical view towards the state, negative view of the state, wants to reduce state power in people's lives. Whereas neoconservatives, with their focus on authority, and they actually want quite a powerful state authority that's able to impose harsh policies, strong enough to close down public services and so on, all of this kind of stuff, and impose its authority. And especially if you want strong law and order, you're talking about increasing respect for authority figures. You want more police, stronger police, more powerful courts and judges and so on and so forth. So some people say, well, here's a contradiction. Do they want a strong state or a weak state? A state that gets involved in dictating people's lives and lifestyles, or one that stays out of it? Contradiction. However, there is an argument that actually these two things go hand in hand. Andrew Gamble, for example, has said, well, in actual fact, if you're going to roll back the state in terms of economics, you think of all of the social unrest that's going to generate. If you're going to close down public services, you're going to throw people off welfare, you're going to have policies that create mass unemployment and so on, that's going to lead to resistance. It's going to lead to unrest, social unrest. Therefore, you're going to need a tough police force that's ready to crack down on that resistance. So there's an argument, actually, neoliberalism, removing the state out of the economy and actually ending the state's role in alleviating poverty effectively, you're going to require a strong state, a strong police, and so on, in order to deal with the fallout of that. So actually, you can't really have neoliberalism without some sort of strong state neoconservatism as well to kind of back it up, the iron fist within the velvet glove, if you like. So that's Gamble's argument, that you need this sort of strong state to deal with the resistance caused by neoliberal policies. There's also deeper incoherence, though. Other people have pointed to that actually that neoliberalism and neoconservatism are based on incompatible values. One values freedom, choice, rights, and competition, the liberal influence behind neoliberalism, and it's based on a vision of human nature that stresses individualism and rationalism and self-reliance and so on, whereas neoconservatism is based on a view of human nature and a value system that prioritizes authority, discipline, respect, duty, view of human nature stressing kind of frailty, fallibility, and dependence. Think of the liberal view and the conservative view of human nature. They're almost opposite, aren't they? Liberals think people can be self-reliant, they're rational, they're the best judge of their own interests. Conservatives believe people are, not particularly rational. They've got a limited capacity for rationality. They're dependent, security-seeking, weak, craven creatures. So how can you have ideologies that view humanity in such opposite terms? How can they ever come together to make one single ideology? It's thought to be incoherent and incompatible. And again, neoliberalism unleashes forces that undermine the social cohesion that conservatives are supposed to value, right? So, removing welfare, removing the safety net, and so on from people's lives, it produces massive insecurity, doesn't it? Conservatives are supposed to value security. So, just one example, one aspect of deregulation is ending restrictions on the movement of capital. And what this has done is it freed up investors to move their money, move investment across the globe. Well, this has arguably undermined both national identity and the power of national governments. So again, another example of how neoliberalism is actually undermining the things that conservatives are supposed to value. So in summary, the key is to understand that the new right is a combination of neoliberalism in the economic sphere and neoconservatism in the social sphere. Neoliberal economics, we mean the return to the laissez-faire free market ideology of classical liberalism, and neoconservative social policies which are emphasizing the restoration of authority, social order, and discipline. And whilst there are those who believe these two aspects are incompatible, coming as they are from two opposing ideological currents based on fundamentally different views of human nature, others believe that they go hand in hand because the chaos and social dislocation unleashed by neoliberalism requires a strong state to crack down on the resistance and provide order. So that is really all I wanted to say to you on the matter this evening. So hopefully this has been of some use. Thanks for listening.